The winter had been relentless, a bitter and unforgiving season that had blanketed the rugged landscape in a thick shroud of white. Snow had been falling since before dusk, not the gentle, picturesque flakes of fireside stories, but the kind that erased roads and softened the world into something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. It was a snow that consumed landmarks and swallowed sound, leaving only the howl of the wind and the deep, chilling silence of the Wild West in its wake. And it was in that vast, white silence that Mai Lin, a Chinese woman of 22, stood barefoot at the edge of the trees, her traditional dark-colored cheongsam, a stark contrast to the unending snow, now stiff with frost. A vibrant red scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck, the only splash of color in a monochrome world, a fragile banner against the storm. Her breath came out in fragile, fleeting clouds, each one a testament to the life that still flickered within her. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity, until the line between fear and cold blurred and became the same raw, gnawing ache in the pit of her stomach. The world had become a dizzying expanse of white, and the lights of a lone cabin, initially a beacon of hope, now blurred through the swirling storm like a promise she could not, trust. Hope was a dangerous currency in this land, one she had learned to spend sparingly. But survival was a more immediate need, a primal urge that drove her forward, step by agonizing step, through the deepening snow. When she finally reached the rough-hewn wooden door of the cabin, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely form a fist to knock. The wood was cold and unyielding beneath her frozen knuckles. She whispered words that felt smaller than her shame, a desperate plea swallowed by the wind. "May I sleep in your cabin, sir?" It's freezing outside. She did not know if mercy lived behind that door, or something far colder, something that would mirror the biting frost that clung to her very bones. The door creaked open, revealing Ronan, a lone rancher of 30, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame filling the doorway. His coat was dusted with a fine layer of snow, evidence of his recent foray into the storm, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, carried the tired watchfulness of a man who had learned to expect disappointment, and often cruelty, from the world. He took in her appearance slowly, his gaze lingering on the frost-bitten fingers clutching her worn bundle, the way she stood ramrod straight, a pillar of quiet dignity even while trembling violently, a spirit that the relentless pain had not yet managed to break. For a long, silent moment, he said nothing at all, the only sounds the crackling of the fire within the cabin and the mournful howl of the wind behind her, a threat eager to be fulfilled. And then, something in Ronan's chest, a place he thought long frozen over, tightened. He stepped aside without a word and held the door wider, a simple gesture that spoke volumes in the desolate wilderness, knowing that in a place like this, kindness was never without cost. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs, and strong coffee grounds, a scent of life and warmth that was almost overwhelming to Mai Lin's senses. She stood just past the threshold, hesitant, as if afraid the very warmth might accuse her of something, of being a burden, of intruding. Her eyes, dark and expressive, were lowered, her shoulders braced for the refusal she still half expected, even after the heavy door had closed behind her, shutting out the storm. Ronan, a man of few words, set another thick log in the stone fireplace. The flames flared as if startled by the unexpected company, casting dancing shadows that played across the rustic room. He offered her a thick woolen blanket, carefully placing it on a nearby stool rather than directly into her hands, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible distances that were sacred between strangers in this untamed land. She accepted it with a slight bow of her head and sat near the hearth, the rough wool a welcome comfort against her frozen skin. She began to thaw slowly, the feeling returning to her numb fingers and toes in a wave of painful pins and needles. In the flickering firelight, she was acutely aware that this safety was as fragile as a pane of ice, a temporary reprieve in a world that had shown her little kindness. As the snow thickened against the small window panes, piling in ever deeper drifts, both of them, the lone rancher and the freezing stranger, wondered how long this fragile peace, this unspoken truce against the storm, could possibly survive. By morning, the storm had not broken. If anything, it had intensified, sealing the cabin in a world of white. The town, a small, insular community a few miles away, had already noticed Ronan's unexpected guest. In places where gossip was a pastime and judgment a currency, word traveled faster than the most sure-footed of horses. By the time Ronan rode into town for supplies, his horse struggling through the deep snow, the sheriff's eyes were already sharp with a familiar, unwelcome suspicion. Sheriff Thompson, a man whose authority was as rigid as the winter ground, leaned against the weathered post outside the general store, his posture casual but his gaze anything but. He spoke softly, a tone that was always more menacing than a shout, telling Ronan in no uncertain terms that the Chinese woman did not belong, that trouble followed her kind like a shadow, and that the town would be a calmer, more orderly place without her presence. Ronan listened without arguing, his jaw set in a hard line, knowing that in a town like this, silence could be its own form of resistance, yet wondering, with a growing sense of unease, how long that silence would hold against the rising tide of prejudice. My Lin felt the town's cold even from the relative sanctuary of the cabin. It was a palpable thing, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. When she ventured to the nearby creek to wash, her movements graceful and deliberate, conversations among the few women she encountered would abruptly stop, replaced by hostile stares and whispered comments she could feel like stones against her back. When she passed the small, white-steepled church on the edge of the settlement, eyes followed her from behind curtained windows, each glance a silent accusation. She returned to the cabin each time with her back straight, her head held high, refusing to let them see the tremor in her hands. She would sweep the freshly fallen snow from the cabin steps with a quiet determination, prepare simple, nourishing meals from what little there was, her hands moving with an efficiency that spoke of a life of hardship. She refused to look like someone who needed to beg for the simple right to exist. At night, after the meager supper was cleared away, she would sit by the fire, the flickering light catching the intricate embroidery on her cheongsam, and mend Ronan's worn coat with careful, precise stitches. He would pretend not to watch the way her hands moved with a practiced grace, a stark contrast to his own calloused, work-roughened fingers. They were both acutely aware that the physical closeness within the small cabin was becoming something more, something far more dangerous than the winter storm outside. It was a fragile intimacy, woven from shared silence and unspoken understanding. One evening, after another fierce storm had sealed the world beyond the cabin into a profound and absolute silence, Ronan left a carefully wrapped bundle on the edge of the simple cot that served as My Lin's bed. Inside, she found a thick wool dress, the color of a stormy sea, soft leather gloves, and a warm, hand-knitted scarf. The items still carried the faint, comforting scent of the general store and, more subtly, of him, of his careful, deliberate choosing. He turned away without a word as she unwrapped them, as though he was afraid that gratitude, spoken aloud, might embarrass them both, might shatter the delicate equilibrium they had established. My Lin reached for the soft fabric with trembling fingers, touching the dress as if it might vanish beneath her hands, a dream she was afraid to wake from. A feeling she had no name for, warm and aching, tightened in her chest. Later that evening, she brewed a pot of strong coffee and carried a steaming cup to him where he sat cleaning his rifle, the firelight glinting off the polished steel. She offered it with a shy, luminous smile that warmed him more deeply than the crackling fire ever could. It was a smile that reached her eyes, crinkling their corners and momentarily erasing the weariness that so often shadowed her features. For the first time, they sat together on the hearth, their knees nearly brushing, sharing the quiet in a way that felt intimate rather than empty. It was a silence that invited wonder instead of fear, a comfortable companionship that neither had expected to find. Outside, the snow piled higher and higher, slowly and relentlessly erasing the world they had known, and within the small, warm cabin, a new one was beginning to form. It was on one of those long, endless nights, with the wind howling a lonely song outside, that Ronan, with an almost boyish uncertainty that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, cleared a small space on the rough planked floor near the table and asked, his voice low and hesitant, if she would dance. There was no music, only the crackling of the fire and the rhythm of their own breathing. His heavy boots were clumsy against the floor, his steps unsure, a stark contrast to the confident way he moved through the world outside. My Lin laughed softly, a sound that was surprised and achingly beautiful, as if joy itself had forgotten her for a long, sorrowful moment, and then, suddenly, had remembered. She moved lightly, gracefully, despite the invisible weight of her past. And when he spun her a little too fast and they nearly stumbled, he caught her at the waist, his touch both instinctive and careful, his large hands gentle against the fabric of her dress. Time seemed to still as they stood there, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath, his heart racing with a feeling he couldn't name, her gaze lifting to meet his, a silent question in their dark depths. Though they stepped apart a moment later, the space between them charged with an unspoken emotion. Both knew that something tender and irrevocable had been spoken without a single word. The town's fragile patience, already worn thin by suspicion and prejudice, finally snapped the day a theft was discovered. A set of valuable tools, essential for survival in the harsh winter, had gone missing from a neighbor's shed, and suspicion, like a hungry wolf, leaped eagerly to my Lynn, as if it had been waiting for just such an opportunity. Sheriff Thompson came to the cabin, this time with a posse of grim-faced men behind him, their voices low but sharp with accusation, telling Ronan to send her away before worse followed, before the town took matters into its own hands. Mylin stood quietly to the side, her face a calm, composed mask that made the injustice of the situation even sharper. She was already folding her few meager belongings, her movements deliberate and resigned. And when Ronan, his voice steady and unwavering, told them that she would stay until the truth was known, the sheriff's smile was thin and full of warning. That night, in the deep, cold hours before dawn could soften the darkness, Mylin tried to leave. She slipped out of her cot, her small bundle clutched tightly to her chest, believing that love, the fragile, budding emotion she felt for the quiet rancher, meant making herself smaller, meant disappearing so that others could breathe easier. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but it was nothing compared to the sharp, aching cold in her heart, the old, familiar instinct telling her that staying had always been, and would always be, the most dangerous choice for a woman like her. Ronan caught her at the door, the icy draft swirling around them. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with a raw, broken emotion as he asked her why she thought disappearing was the only way to keep the peace, as if the very idea of her leaving wounded him deeply. She answered without tears, for she had learned long ago how to survive without them, telling him, her voice soft but firm, that the world had shown her, time and time again, what happened to women like her when they lingered where they were not wanted. The simple, unadorned truth in her words settled heavy and sharp between them, more cutting than any accusation. Ronan felt something inside him, a wall he had carefully constructed around his heart, crack open. He took her hands then, his touch surprisingly gentle, as though he were afraid she might vanish into the swirling snow if he held on too tightly. He promised, not with a raised voice or a grand, empty vow, but with a quiet, steady resolve that she could feel in his touch, that he would stand for her. He would uncover the truth, he told her, even if it cost him the town's respect, even if it cost him everything he had built for himself in this lonely corner of the world. He did not fight with raised fists or loud, angry demands, but with a quiet patience that refused to bend. He listened where others were eager to accuse, he watched where others had already turned away in judgment. He spent days asking quiet questions, observing the subtle shifts in the town's mood, until the truth, as it often does, finally emerged into the clear, cold light of day. The real thief, a young farmhand desperate to pay off a gambling debt, stood exposed at last, shame flooding his face as the protection he had expected from the town's collective prejudice slipped away, leaving him small and unmistakably human. Sheriff Thompson had little to say when the truth surfaced, his silence heavier and more damning than any apology could ever be. The town's eyes, once so full of accusation, now fell away from Mylin in an uneasy, shamefaced recognition. They were unsure how to face this woman who had carried the weight of their cruelty with such quiet dignity, and still stood whole. As Mylin and Ronan walked back to the cabin together through the gently falling snow, their steps slow and close, she felt something deep within her, a knot of fear and sorrow she had carried for so long, finally begin to loosen. It was not a feeling of triumph, nor the sharp, fleeting satisfaction of being proven right. It was something far more precious, the quiet, profound reclaiming of a dignity she had once believed the world had the power to steal from her. The snow brushed her shoulders gently, and for the first time, it did not feel like a burden, but like a soft, silent witness to her resilience. Love followed quietly, inevitably, after that. It slipped into their days the way fresh snow settles over a familiar landscape, soft and transformative, changing everything without ever asking to be noticed. It was in the way he started leaving a cup of hot tea by her bedside each morning, in the way she would hum a soft, unfamiliar melody as she cooked, a tune from a life he knew nothing about but longed to understand. One evening by the fire, as the flames whispered and the shadows danced along the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, Ronan finally spoke the words that had been growing in his heart. His voice was low and unguarded, stripped of its usual gruffness. He was not offering a grand, poetic confession, but a simple, unvarnished truth he could no longer carry alone. He told her that the cabin, once his solitary sanctuary, no longer felt like a shelter unless she was in it. He confessed that every corner seemed to hold the echo of her warmth, even when she was silent, and that the thought of a life without her, a return to the lonely silence that had once defined his existence, felt colder and more desolate than any winter he had ever known. My Lynn did not answer with words. She leaned into him instead, a silent, eloquent response, resting her head against his broad shoulder, her fingers finding his as if they had always belonged there. And in that gentle, unspoken closeness, he felt a sense of being seen, of being understood, in a way that stole his breath and settled a profound peace in his soul. Outside, the storm finally began to ease, the wind quieting its mournful howl as the snow fell more softly, as though the world itself had paused to listen to a love that was finally brave enough to stay. Their wedding came in the heart of that same winter, a simple and quiet ceremony held beneath a pale, hushed sky, as fat, fluffy snowflakes drifted down like tender blessings meant only for them. My Lynn wore the modest wool dress Ronan had bought for her, its dark blue fabric moving softly with the gentle wind. Her long, dark hair was braided with loving care, each intricate strand a quiet testament to the long and arduous road she had walked to stand there, whole and beloved. Ronan stood beside her, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he removed his worn hat, his eyes never leaving her face, as though the vast, snow-covered world had narrowed to this single, fragile, perfect moment. They spoke their vows not with words of grandeur or flowery prose, but of simple, heartfelt devotion. They promised to be a shelter for each other when the storms of life returned, to choose one another, again and again, when the world turned cruel or cold. They vowed to walk forward hand in hand, even when the path ahead disappeared beneath the snow. When they kissed, it was slow and reverent, a kiss filled with the unspoken knowledge of all they had endured together, and all they still promised to protect. It was the kind of kiss shared only by two souls who had already survived the worst and knew, with an unshakable certainty, that they always would. Married life unfolded not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 small, radiant moments that felt almost sacred in their simplicity. There were quiet mornings where they shared coffee from the same warm cup, their hands brushing, as the pale winter light slipped through the frosted window pines. Ronan would often reach out and touch her fingers with his own, as if to reassure himself that she was real, that the day would not steal her away. The evenings found them cooking side by side in the small, warm kitchen, her laughter, soft and bright, ringing through the cabin when a dusting of flour landed on his coat. He would pull her close then, burying his face in her hair, just to breathe her in, as though joy itself was a fleeting thing that might fade if he did not hold it tight. They danced by the fire often, no longer clumsy and hesitant, but slow and unhurried, his forehead resting against hers, every step less like a practice and more like a silent promise that this warmth, this love, was real and freely chosen. On nights when the cold deepened and the world outside was frozen and still, they would wrap themselves in a shared blanket and sit on the porch together, watching the snow drift down in an endless, peaceful silence. My Lynn's head would rest on his shoulder while Ronan traced gentle, lazy circles on her palm, neither of them needing words to say what they both knew: they were safe, they were home. Sometimes, in a soft whisper that was almost carried away by the wind, she would tell him how she had never imagined a life could be this gentle, this kind. And he would answer not with words, but by kissing her hair, filled with a gratitude so profound it felt almost painful. The town watched them from a distance, their initial hostility slowly giving way to a grudging respect, and then to a quiet, uncertain transformation. It was as if they were learning, through the simple, undeniable evidence of Ronan and My Lynn's life together, that love, when tended with patience and grace, had the power to soften even the hardest of winters, and the most hardened of hearts. Years later, when the snow still fell without asking for permission, and the warm, steady light of the cabin still burned like a beacon against the darkness, their story was remembered in the town. It was not a story of gunfire or glory, of heroes or villains, but for the simple, profound act of a single door being opened on a freezing night, and a choice made with a trembling hand, yet a fearless heart. It lived on in the quiet, everyday things, the way that light in the cabin window never went out, no matter how harsh the winter storm, the way two shadows could always be seen moving together behind the frosted glass, the way that laughter, clear and true, would sometimes drift out into the snow like a blessing. And if you listen closely on a cold winter's night, truly listen, you can still hear their story in the wind as it moves through the tall pines. It whispers that love, true love, rarely arrives loudly or demands to be believed. It comes softly, a stranger in a storm, asking only for shelter. And when you dare to let it stay, it has the power to warm a life, and sometimes, if you are very lucky, a whole world, forever.